When it comes to gaming PCs, we all want to know one thing: whether it plays my favorite game with nice graphics and smooth frame rates. But when it comes to gaming handhelds, all the rules change. Now we want to know things like how easy is it to carry around, how comfortable is it to hold, how big is the screen, and are the built-in controls any good? Well, I'm NihongoGamer and this is the AYANEO Air 1S, and with its snappy 7840U processor and light form factor, it makes every other handheld PC look clumsy and unnecessary by comparison. But specs don't tell you everything about a handheld, and on this channel we care a lot about how it feels in day-to-day use. It may have lots of fancy numbers on paper, but is it really good enough to replace the bigger handhelds? It's time to look at the AYANEO Air 1S. Now there's already some great coverage of the AYANEO Air 1S, and as many will tell you, it's got a crazy amount of power for such a tiny device. Full disclaimer, AYANEO sent me this free of charge for the purposes of making this video. I wasn't asked to say anything specific, I don't have to return it at the end, and all opinions are my own. And in the time since receiving it, I've brought the Air 1S out with me far more often than my other handhelds, the Steam Deck, the Asus ROG Ally, and even my Nintendo Switch. It's smaller than everything else, seems to be as powerful as the Ally, and since it's a Windows-based machine, there's almost no limit to what games you can run on it. But as important as specs are, most people are not buying a handheld expecting it to be better than a desktop gaming PC. They're trying to find a handheld that's convenient, portable, and has all the power they need, but also playable without a docking station, controller, and external monitor. On this channel, I've been covering handhelds since the PS Vita, and while power is nice, there's so much more to a great handheld than just processors and tons of RAM. The Air 1S is a return to the initial dream of a tiny gaming PC that fits in your pocket. And for many people, the Steam Deck was actually the beginning of the handheld gaming PC, but actually, these things started coming out like 5 or 6 years ago, with smaller handhelds that were much closer to things like the PS Vita or the 3DS in terms of form factor. They just didn't have the built-in GPU power to make them popular and were better for things like emulation and retro gaming. Fast forward to present day and now we have the Air 1S, AAA gaming on the go like the Steam Deck and the Ally, but somehow compressed into a case that's much closer to something like a Nintendo Switch Lite. On the inside it's running the AMD 7840U processor, which for most intents and purposes is pretty similar to the Z1 Extreme that you get in the ROG Ally. But unlike the tiny handhelds from back in 2017, you have the graphical oomph of RDNA 3. Chipsets from 5 years ago had onboard graphics, but even back then they were only okay when it came to 2D games, and for 3D it was almost completely useless. Well, while the Air 1S is perfect for short, fun indie games like 10 Second Ninja or Vampire Survivors, it can also handle brand new titles like Street Fighter 6, which you definitely don't want to be playing without a locked 60 FPS frame rate. Now, a few weeks ago I actually posted my first impressions review, and honestly speaking, not a lot has changed since then. But now that I've been living with it for a little longer, I think it's time to discuss whether this is still the handheld I carry around the most. The Air 1S has one of the nicest screens on all of the PC handhelds out right now, and that's because unlike the Steam Deck, this display is OLED. Personally, I'm more used to standard LCD, so it took me a little while to get used to the richer colors and saturation. But I think what really stuck out to me is that there's no simple way to toggle different color profiles in the ISpace software. ISpace 2 is the overlay that makes things much easier to navigate, since for whatever reason, even with Windows 11, there's still no real built-in mode that turns the OS into something usable on a handheld, where the screen is smaller and you don't have a mouse or a keyboard. So no, there's no simple way to change the color profiles, but again, it's Windows, so you can always set it up manually if you want to. Most people think that high saturation is better anyway, so they probably won't even want to change it. When it comes to refresh rate, it's on par with the Steam Deck since it's a 60Hz display, but with all that power and such a portable package, I really did miss the 120Hz display of the ROG Ally. You won't be running 120Hz in most AAA titles, but it's just perfect for indie games, and since most of them require less power, I really wanted that option here on the Air 1S. That being said, it's already $100 more than the equivalent ROG Ally and much more portable, so I don't blame them for sticking with 60Hz and avoiding that even higher price tag. The next thing that's important when deciding whether to make this your main handheld is the size, and that's a big one, or should I say, a small one. According to the marketing, Steam Deck is 669 grams, Ally is 608 grams, and the Air 1S is just 450 grams. If you seriously want it even lighter, you can go for the ultra thin and light edition, which is a whopping 40% lighter than the Steam Deck. Now, the Air 1S is technically very light, but in practice, it actually feels kind of hefty, and that's because for this form factor, the Nintendo Switch Lite is still 40% lighter at just 276 grams. grams. But all this nitpicking aside, it's great. Since it's so small, you'll most likely be playing it more with quite a loose grip, and so it might feel kinda tiring for long play sessions. But personally, I wasn't using it for that. It's just so convenient to have a handheld that takes up like no space in my bag that I can whip out for 10 or 15 minutes here and there. Speaking of grips, in my initial review, I did mention how this form factor sort of encourages you to hold it loosely, and as a result, higher up. It's not quite as good a neck position as having a 3DS where the screen is significantly higher, but for that I've got my eyes set on the new AYANEO slide that they just announced. The Air 1S is comfortable to hold though, and that brings us to the most important aspect of a good handheld, the controls. As I mentioned before, controls are the main focus of this channel, and even if the screen was 360Hz and the graphics were double that of a PS5, I still wouldn't take it anywhere if the controls weren't up to scratch, and with the Air 1S, there's plenty to like here. The analog sticks are comparable to the Switch Joy-Cons, but with Hall effect sensors, so in theory, they shouldn't suffer from stick drift over time. The face buttons are small but snappy enough, and the shoulder buttons are clicky, but don't wiggle around loosely. The triggers feel really smooth, but they're not really molded like most other pads these days. I also felt like it rotated from a different pivot point to other triggers, but not in a way that made it difficult to use, just different. What I really want to draw attention to, however, is this, the D-pad. There's no part of any controller that gets more scrutiny on this channel than this part right here. I've seen plenty of other reviewers who find that the D-pad is perfectly adequate on all the various handhelds that they try out, but personally, as a puzzle and fighting game fan, I tend to find myself liking or disliking D-pads in ways that fans of other genres probably just don't have to worry about as much. For example, the D-pad in most 3D action games is just used for switching weapons or accessing various shortcuts. But in a puzzle game or fighting game, the D-pad is used for movement. So the difference between a cardinal input and diagonal input for just a single frame of animation often means the difference between life and death. In the game, of course. To put this into context, say you're playing Tetris Effect and you want to move a block left or right. Well, on the Air 1S, it's almost like a 10% chance that you'll get a diagonal up left or up right instead, which will fast drop your block in totally the wrong position. Can you imagine fast dropping blocks into completely the wrong place every 10 blocks or so? Yeah, it's not fun. Now, to some extent, you can tiptoe around this issue by being really careful to only press on the very edges of the D-pad, but this feels unnatural, becomes tiresome, and to be honest, the diagonals still happen. Now, for the most part, in platform games, you may not notice issues like accidental diagonals because jump is set to a button, not the D-pad. In racing games, you'll be using mostly just the analog stick. And playing Monster Hunter on a tiny handheld with an OLED screen is an experience you certainly won't be getting on a Nintendo Switch Lite anytime soon. For anything that doesn't use the D-pad, I really felt like I had some kind of super switch because the Joy-Con style sticks are fine for most things, and the face buttons are surprisingly quiet. But then I tried some fighting games and, well, that's where the frustration began. A D-pad doesn't have to do much to be good, but surprisingly at least 90% of every handheld or third-party controller out there falls flat on its face, just trying to do what the SNES controller did just fine almost 3 decades ago. One thing the Air 1S gets right is having a pivot underneath the D-pad itself. This prevents activation of all directions at the same time, which for obvious reasons would ruin your inputs. But that's about as far as it gets. The pivot itself is clearly too low because when you push down in the middle, it's really difficult to stay there, so you end up getting sucked into one of the 8 directions. But pushing in the middle isn't something you're going to be doing often. What you will be doing thousands and thousands of times over and over again is incredibly simple technical inputs. Fireballs, dragon punches, super combos. If you only plan to use modern mode in Street Fighter 6, then I don't know, maybe you can get by. Just do any combo involving a down forward input followed by a quarter circle back. The D-pad will jump straight over the down input, resulting in an incomplete command and you just standing there looking dumb, wondering how you made this mistake. Anyway, I digress. For fighting games, kind of frustrating. But weirdly, I found that the D-pad on the Air 1S was actually preferable to the ROG Ally for some games like Project Diva. If you're not careful when holding down a cardinal direction, you can accidentally roll into a diagonal by accident for sure, but it's not quite as bad as on the Ally. The Ally felt like it suffered from this much worse because instead of a plus-shaped D-pad, it actually uses a circular D-pad. Honestly speaking though, if you play fighting games, both are pretty frustrating, and the D-pad on the Steam Deck didn't really do it for me either. Oh well, maybe in the year 2028 when the next generation of handhelds launch and people actually care about D-pads. Oh, who am I kidding? It'll never happen. Just bring a wireless pad around with you and put the Air 1S on a stand. Problem solved. There are a few other issues which I've talked about in more detail in my first impressions review, which I'll leave a link to below. The screen is mounted upside down, which is not a problem for most games, but stuff like Hot Shots Racing still isn't fixed on the developer side, so yeah. This isn't AYANEO's fault, but the fact remains that it's still a problem and you can only play this game upside down. Then there's the weird approach to audio. I think most people haven't noticed it yet, but the speakers sound like they're using a psychoacoustic effect to widen the stereo field so that it sounds bigger than it really is. It seems like it's playing the left-right channels out of phase or something to achieve this, and as someone who studied sound engineering in college, it kinda drives me nuts. One more thing which still hasn't changed since I showed my initial review to AYANEO is the inability to map the home button. In Steam Big Picture mode, this button is crucial for accessing Steam menus, and even though the Air 1S has 2 extra buttons on the top edge which you can program to do almost anything, it still can't be done. There's no option to set one of these buttons as your home button, and using a keyboard macro like Shift-Tab didn't work either. The only solution I could find was to connect a Bluetooth keyboard and just actually press Shift-Tab. Finally, the unit does get pretty hot. I've heard other people say that it's quieter than the ROG Ally, but in my experience, it's been similar, if not louder. I think having all the components crammed together means it's pretty desperate for cool air, and even if it gets it, it feels hotter to hold than other handhelds just because the hotspots are that much closer to your hands. Not burning hot, but you definitely notice it. Listen, I get pretty specific about what I want when it comes to handhelds. Everything you've heard about in other videos saying that it's a huge amount of power in a portable package is absolutely true though. If you want a really small handheld but you don't want to sacrifice on power, this is it. And as a bonus, it looks absolutely gorgeous. At $100 more than a similarly spec'd ROG Ally, which is already significantly more pricey than a baseline Steam Deck, it's not for the budget conscious, that's for sure. But personally, I'm glad that we have this option. I have to choose my games carefully since the D-pad is not really ideal for puzzle or fighting games, but a handheld as small as a Nintendo Switch Lite with a game library that's thousands of times bigger, when I go out and I just need a handheld for 15 minutes of downtime here and there, I'll most likely still be reaching for the Air 1S. Well, that's all I've got time for today. Subscribe if you loved it, like the video if you haven't done so already, and tell me, what feature do you think is most important in a PC gaming handheld? Is it power? Is it screen size? Is it just straight up portability? Let me know in the comments section below. That's all for today. I've been NihongoGamer, and I'll see you real soon.